This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today in Syria, where 33 Turkish soldiers stationed in the rebel-held Idlib province were killed in an airstrike by Russian-backed Syrian forces on Thursday. It's a major escalation in the all-out offensive by Bashar al-Assad's regime and its Russian allies that has displaced some 900,000 people from northwestern Syria since December. Turkey, which has long backed rebel forces in Syria, has vowed to respond in kind, as UN Secretary General António Guterres calls for an immediate ceasefire, saying, quote, "The risk of even greater escalation grows by the hour." Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reportedly spoke by phone on Friday to discuss the crisis as NATO urged rapid de-escalation. This comes as Turkey has temporarily opened its border for fleeing Syrian refugees to cross through the country to Europe.
Of the nearly 1 million people displaced from Syria since December alone, at least half of them are children. It's the single largest displacement in a 9-year war that's forced 13 million to flee, left hundreds of thousands dead. As a humanitarian catastrophe deepens, aid workers are describing scenes of chaos and devastation on the ground, with hundreds of thousands of families scrambling for shelter as temperatures fall below freezing. Children have frozen to death in the dire conditions. All the while, bombs continue to fall. On Tuesday, the Syrian regime bombed 8 school facilities, killing 21 people, according to aid workers. This is UNICEF's Executive Director, Henrietta Fore.
Tens of thousands are now living in makeshift tents in public buildings, in open air, huddled under trees, exposed to rain and snow and sub-zero cold of the harsh Syrian winter. The recent strikes on these makeshift camps in Idlib and on the children and teachers horrifically killed just 2 days ago as 10 schools were attacked are both reprehensible and morally repugnant. Also, these acts clearly demonstrate the terrifying daily conditions of those living through this nightmare. And we've heard and read reports of children freezing to death. When wood runs out, families burn whatever they can find. Plastic bags, garbage, discarded furniture, just to provide a flicker of heat against the cold, or a simple fire to cook whatever food they can find. In these informal settlements, children and women are at particular risk of violence and exploitation. Makeshift toilets offer no safety or privacy. Landmines and improvised explosive devices dot the landscape. Every step people take is a risk. In the Northwest, 280,000 children have had their education cruelly snatched away. An estimated 180 schools are out of operation, destroyed, damaged, or being used for shelters. Another blow to children's hopes and futures. Access to health care is almost non-existent or financially out of reach. Hospitals continue to be targeted. 72 have suspended services because of the fighting.
That's UNICEF's Executive Director, Henrietta Fore, addressing the UN Security Council yesterday. Well, for more, we're joined here in New York by our guest, Avril Benoît. She's Executive Director of Médecins Sans Frontières USA, that's MSF, or Doctors Without Borders USA. Welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about the crisis in Syria. 900,000 people. Talk about the scope of this.
The scope is unprecedented, certainly for Idlib. That whole area was considered a kind of safe zone. People who had been relocated because of the retaking of territory and different movements of people, many of them had ended up in this Idlib area. It was, yes, controlled by opposition armed groups. We were trying to support hospitals there. What we found in the last couple of days, of course, is that they've been subjected to aerial bombardment, to shelling, to ground forces. It has been catastrophic. From a humanitarian perspective, you've got the displacement of people, which you heard about. In our own hospitals that we support, which are run by very brave, very courageous Syrian medical teams, They were dealing with an influx, a mass casualty group of people with very severe injuries, conducting 30 operations, surgical operations in a day, 185 patients coming in, 18 of them arrived and were declared dead upon arrival, a lot of children. And these surgeries, even, just to focus on the medical piece, these are complex surgeries. You've got people whose limbs have been amputated as buildings have collapsed on them. And the stocks, the supplies of anesthesia for those surgeons has been desperately low. And so you can imagine the horror of being a medical physician, of being a medical personnel, trying to alleviate the suffering of people, that you're trying to heal them and repair their wounds and their excruciating pain. Meanwhile, you're working and you hear the shelling, you hear the bombing, you hear the screaming, you hear people experiencing panic attacks all around you, because, I mean, it's absolutely frightening. So then you've got what's happening on the outside of these hospital facilities, where people are fleeing en masse. And so this is where we see that for this Idlib region, it's an unprecedented catastrophe. And even when you look at the history, 9 years of war in Syria, we have seen horrific things go on. And if, no one can say that this is the end game, or that it's going to end anytime soon. But certainly it's absolutely shocking, even to those who have been used to it, if you will. The humanitarian organizations, the Syrian doctors, all these people that have been focused on it, even the journalists who've been watching this space, are absolutely shocked by the suffering going on right now.
Well, I wanted to ask you about all of the groups that are involved in fighting, because obviously Turkey has moved into the Idlib province. The Syrians are backed by the Russians. There are still guerrilla groups that had been in opposition for a while. What about the issue of all of these outside groups coming in and using this territory to conduct these wars, because it's the civilian population that suffers?
They do suffer. And you can imagine that when we're talking about maybe 3 million people living in a zone, they're not all part of these combatants, these various groups. They are not legitimate targets under international humanitarian law. It's mostly civilians living there. So yes, there's all kinds of proxy war activities, different splinter groups, different factions and allegiances. There's no question, though, that under international humanitarian law, indiscriminate bombing is not allowed. We're talking about bombings of schools which had maybe been turned into shelters for families. Most of the people that are on the run, as is often the case when there's a mass displacement of people in the context of war, are women and children. You cannot say that they were active combatants, and you cannot say that it's legitimate at all to raise or try to raise the places where they were trying to survive.
Of the nearly 1 million people displaced from Syria just since December, at least half are children. I want to turn to Jenna, a 10-year-old Syrian child who was displaced by the Russian-backed Syrian government offensive against Idlib.
I felt sadness. I lived in Marat and had friends there who were targeted by a plane and died. I cried as I left when the regime took over. I hope its people will be able to return one day, and that we will be able to go back to Ghouta. This is injustice.
So, Avril Benoît, talk about the devastation of the children. I mean, the New York Times had this major piece on children freezing to death, and then about the UN Secretary General's call for an immediate ceasefire, saying the risk of even greater escalation grows by the hour.
Yeah, so specifically for the children, you've seen maybe, or you've heard the reports of some families having trained their children to react with giggles to the sound of bombs. I mean, these are coping mechanisms that the parents are trying to create, this bubble of safety, a sense of reassurance to children who, of course, just want to grow and play and learn. They want to be in school. We are absolutely devastated to see the condition they're in, because not only are they suffering the consequences of the direct violence, so shrapnel wounds, being trapped under collapsed buildings and so forth, there's also the problem of heating. So when you are sleeping even in a tent, for the lucky ones that actually have had access to a camp and a tent, there are 1,000 camps, if not more, in Idlib province. Many of the people are trying to heat those tents in the ways that they can, suffering asphyxiation. So we've had entire family die of asphyxiation. They're using whatever fuels that they can scrounge around. And so what we've managed to do as a life-saving activity, and you wouldn't necessarily think of this as an essential thing for life, but to give them some warmth, we're transferring 300 tons of this compressed fuel for burning so that they can warm themselves. For the kids, it's not only that, because there's also malnutrition that can be a consequence of all of this. The families don't have access to the kind of food sources that a child needs to grow, to thrive, even for their brain development. And so this is another consequence of the war, in addition to probably what you're going to see, and I'm speculating here, but the consequences over generations of the emotional trauma. This can be a marker that will affect those kids in the years ahead. And for 9 years, many kids who have been displaced within Syria, not to mention the ones that managed to go to the surrounding countries like Lebanon and Turkey, is that not all of them have had access to school. So you've got a whole generation now that will be that much further handicapped in a way from that lack of educational opportunity.
I wanted to ask you about the potential impact of Turkey opening its borders again to refugees. Admittedly, Turkey has already suffered a huge refugee crisis as a result of this, but how that could potentially alleviate the current situation somewhat.
Yeah, Turkey has 3.5 million, if not more, Syrian asylum seekers, refugees, and of course you know that many of them are trying to even leave Turkey. It's a very sensitive situation, and I know that the diplomatic corps is working on this at the various political levels. We'd like things to move faster. Certainly, we don't have the answer to whether Turkey should let them all in, under what circumstances. We're apolitical in this. We're a humanitarian responder. But something has to change. I mean, you can't just have an area at the border where people are trapped as there's an encroaching military incursion that considers them a target for indiscriminate bombing. I mean, it's an absolutely untenable situation, and you can imagine that anyone would want to flee that area, and when all the options are closed around them, what are these people supposed to do? We're talking about millions of people.